Hey, it's Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to the present. Today we're going to pick up with Unit 12, America, Change, Turmoil, and War. What we're going to talk about is that changing period in American history. We're going to see 3 assassination attempts. We're going to see the fighting in the Vietnam War, and just a few other little things that we're going to sprinkle in there for good measure. Today we'll start with the new frontier, and that's going to be the Kennedy administration starting in 1961 and ends abruptly, of course, in 1963 with his assassination. What we're going to do is look at the unit focus questions for this particular unit. We have 4. Identify and describe Kennedy and Johnson's domestic and foreign policy goals, trials, and accomplishments. Identify the origin, major players, strategies, and accomplishments of the modern civil rights movement. Describe the impact the Vietnam War had on American life and politics, and what impact did the civil rights movement have on underserved and underrepresented groups in America. So basically what we're going to be doing is talking about a whole lot of stuff and fitting in a whole lot of information in a very short time. So keep on, keep up, buckle up, and let's get started. We'll start with the vocabulary. We have the academic vocabulary and content vocabulary, and as we always tell you, make sure that you take your journals out, define these terms for yourself, and we'll address as many of them as we can as we go into the lesson. The lesson focus questions, unlike unit focus questions, the lesson focus questions we will address. And there are 4 lesson focus questions for this particular lesson. What impact did the election of 1960 have on future presidential elections? Describe JFK's domestic agenda. What Supreme Court cases changed American society during the 1960s? And what actions were taken by JFK to prevent the spread of communism? And how did America react to the assassination of JFK? Well, we'll go ahead and we'll get started first with the do now activity. Take out your journals, write down this particular topic, and what it says in 1960, John F. Kennedy is elected as the youngest president in the history of the United States. Why would many look at his age as a reason not to vote for him in the election of 1960? And with that, take a few minutes and get your answers at this time. All right, you should have had enough time that you were able to go through, of course, and look at our do now activity. John F. Kennedy is the youngest elected president of the United States of America. At that time, he's not the youngest president. Theodore Roosevelt has that honor, but he's the youngest elected president. And there was a whole lot of misgivings about whether or not we should elect him president of the United States of America. A lot of people didn't think that he was old enough or mature enough or had enough world experience that he should have the responsibility of taking on such a great task. But in the end, the electoral vote and the popular vote in the election of 1960 goes to the inexperienced John F. Kennedy, and the loser in this particular election in 1960 is going to be Richard Nixon, who was the former vice president of the United States of America during the Eisenhower administration. We'll start with the presidential election of 1960. And as we said, JFK is the Democrat, Nixon is the Republican. The election was the first in history that was televised, had televised debates, which probably aided Kennedy's narrow win over Vice President Nixon. Kennedy gave Americans his legislative agenda called the New Frontier, which would give health insurance to the elderly, provide more education funding, raise the minimum wage, provide affordable housing, and revitalize cities. Much of the New Frontier failed to pass Congress because of Kennedy's lack of a mandate, and the Southern Democrats mistrusted him on civil rights. In other words, they didn't feel like that they could trust him to do right by the Southern states in their minds in terms of slowing civil rights, and as a result, Southern Democrats, or those people who would become the Dixiecrats, did very little to support him in his legislative agenda. Here's a picture of the election of 1960 on the left. You have the first debate and the second debate between Kennedy and Nixon on the right over here. And what you notice, of course, is that it's what a lot of Americans noticed. They noticed that Kennedy was comfortable in front of the camera, he was handsome, and Nixon appeared to be just the opposite of all those things. And because of that, Kennedy looked like the more experienced politician, and Nixon did not. And as a result, a lot of young people in America voted for Kennedy, and Kennedy wins the election in 1960. New Frontier successes. Now, this whole New Frontier, or this Camelot, as his presidency was called by, that term was coined by his wife, actually, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, Jacqueline Kennedy, who becomes one of the big icons of the 1960s political scene. And we're going to talk about her a little bit later. What were some of the successes of the New Frontier? Continued economic prosperity, passage of the Housing Act to provide low-cost housing, passage of the Equal Pay Act to guarantee women equal pay, the passage of the Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act to build mental health centers and provide mental health training for those working with the developmentally disabled. So when we look at it, we're talking about administration, of course, that goes a long way towards building this domestic agenda that looks after the American people. That's what a lot of people say that Democrats or the liberals, of course, have done throughout the history of this country since post-Reconstruction. The Warren Court rulings, there were a few Warren Court rulings of the 1960s that became precedents which guide American politics and citizens' rights during the 1960s, and these are those landmark cases. Baker v. Carr, Reynolds v. Sims, Mapp v. Ohio, Gideon v. Wainwright, Escobedo v. Illinois, Miranda v. Arizona, which one that everybody's pretty much familiar with, Engel v. Vitale, Abington School District versus Shemp, and Griswold v. Connecticut. At this time, what we'll do is pause the presentation, allow you time to copy the activity on landmark Supreme Court cases. Once you have completed the activity, you should turn it into your teacher to be graded. Good luck, and we will see you in a bit to review your answers. At this time, go ahead and see about completing, copying the worksheet, and once you've done that, we'll give you some time to complete it. You should have had enough time that you were able to go through, of course, and answer those questions regarding the 1960s landmark Supreme Court cases. We hope you turned them into your teacher and hope you did a great job. The key is included, of course, in the presentation, and what we'll do is take a few minutes and go through some of the possible answers that you should have gotten. Well, when you look at it, one of the important cases was Baker v. Carr. And it was the U.S. Supreme Court's rule that the federal courts could hear cases regarding the draw of legislative districts. In other words, one of the things that the government wanted to do was to prevent gerrymandering, which means that a political party could draw the lines in such a way that it basically favored them, and it went afoul to the rule of one person, one vote. We also, one of the ones that most people are the most familiar with is Miranda v. Arizona, adjudicated in June 13, 1966. And the court ruled that individuals must be informed of their rights to remain silent and to an attorney during police interrogations. And then Griswold versus Connecticut down at the very bottom. It says June 7, 1965, the year it was adjudicated, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution protects the right to privacy. And that becomes very, very important a little bit later when you look at its impact, because what it does is it impacts Roe v. Wade in 1973. We hope you had a good time, of course, going through, and hope you were successful in looking at those 60s landmark cases. And if you didn't, well, you'll do better next time. All right, we're going to talk about JFK a little bit in communism. JFK continued the policies of Truman and Eisenhower seeking to contain communism. JFK espoused a more flexible approach to dealing with communist expansion. Unlike Eisenhower, he wanted to rely on a strong conventional military, which led to the increase in the size of the military and the creation of special forces like the Green Berets. JFK also authorized more nuclear weapons to deter Soviet aggression, and JFK also believed that economic aid and cooperation was the key to preventing the spread of communism, especially in the Western Hemisphere. The Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps were two programs created to promote goodwill through action. In other words, one of the things that JFK thought, it was just as important, of course, to show goodwill to nations to prevent the spread of communism as it was to show might. In other words, it's here. When you look at Eisenhower and the threat, of course, that Eisenhower used was brinkmanship, of course, in the threat of nuclear retaliation. Kennedy reserves the right, of course, to do those kind of things, but he also believes that the best way, in his mind, to prevent the spread of communism is for the United States of America to be seen as a haven against communism, as a means to economic success. And with that, we could resist communism. What that does, of course, we have these two organizations, of course, the Alliance for Progress and Peace Corps, that will be created to bring the good news throughout the Western Hemisphere and throughout the rest of the world. The Peace Corps, of course, is going to be created, and it's going to take a message throughout the rest of the world in terms of the United States of America as an ambassador of peace and economic development. And then when you look at the Alliance for Progress, it's more or less going to be centered in the Western Hemisphere. The space race, the launch of Sputnik, and we talked about Sputnik being that first satellite that was launched into space by the Soviet Union that made the United States of America believe that it was behind in the space race and behind in missile technology. Because of that, JFK commits to gaining the lead by pledging America's commitment to put a man on the moon before 1970. And June 16, 1969, Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin reached the moon, and it was one small step for man and one giant step for mankind. The race to space increased technology that improved American domestic life by creating new insulations, water and air filters, smaller computers, batteries, etc. So not only is the space race, of course, responsible for putting the United States of America ahead in terms of looking at the space technology, but also in terms of looking at modern technology that will make Americans' lives easier. The race to space. You have Yuri Gagarin, who was a Russian cosmonaut who was the first into space, and then you have Alan Shepard, of course, who was the first American in space. And once again, it was very problematic for the United States of America because since the creation of the atomic weapon, the United States of America thought it was ahead in terms of looking at technology, but we come to find out that the Soviets may be ahead of us in terms of looking at technology. And it's going to lead to some changes in the way that we do things in education, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Here's John Glenn, who's the first American to orbit the Earth and later longtime senator from Ohio. He becomes one of the celebrated heroes of America. And here you have the moon landing that happened, of course, in 1969 with Aldrin, Collins, of course, and Armstrong. And here you have the lunar module, of course, over on the right. All right, JFK struggles against the Soviet Union. One of the greatest worries with electing JFK was the inexperience in foreign affairs. Unlike Eisenhower and Truman, who were grizzled vets in international relations, JFK didn't have a lot. And as a result of that lack of experience, he's going to have some trouble with the Bay of Pigs, where the United States of America backs the movement, of course, to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba, which falls. And then, of course, the Soviet Union would construct the Berlin Wall in 1961, which is seen as a little bit of a failure. And then the biggest triumph he had, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he threatened the Soviet Union to remove missiles that they were putting in Cuba. And that, of course, almost leads to a nuclear war, but JFK in the end it prevails. Here's a picture of that Cuban Missile Crisis, and you see some of those sites, of course, where the missiles were. And then on the right over there, you see the range of where those missiles, of course, could attack the United States of America and from Cuba, which is right there in the middle of that bullseye. Here's some pictures of the JFK's Bay of Pigs disaster, where those freedom fighters, of course, were caught by Castro, and the United States of America's effort to overthrow Castro and communist Cuba failed. Kennedy is assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, a day in infamy for the United States of America. JFK was shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas. Questions linger until this day as to the motivation, causing many conspiracy theorists. 2 days after JFK was killed, Jack Ruby killed Oswald, and any real hope of discovering what really happened was lost. The Warren Commission was convened to answer questions around the assassination, but it concluded that Oswald had acted alone, even though many questions around the assassination remain unanswered. On the left, you have Lee Harvey Oswald, and on the right, his killer, Jack Ruby. And then here's an infamous photograph of the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald. All right, that leads us to those four lesson focus questions. The first question is, what impact did the election of 1960 have on the future of presidential elections? And then, so let's look at those first three. What impact did the election of 1960 have on future presidential elections? The election of 1960 brought to the forefront the impact of images on the television screen, and not just policy, as a driving force in who we choose for president, possibly style over substance. So remember, Kennedy was handsome, Nixon was not. Kennedy was poised, Nixon was not. Kennedy was young, Nixon was not. Describe JFK's domestic agenda. It was a new frontier, and its purpose was to expand civil rights, to aid the poor, improve education, aid the disabled, cut taxes, and raise the minimum wage. And the third lesson focus question, how did the Supreme Court cases change American society during the 1960s? It expanded the principle of one person, one vote regarding congressional apportionment, extended due process and expanded the rights of the accused, and it clarified the idea of separation of church and state. And the last two questions are for lesson one. What actions were taken by JFK to prevent the spread of communism? JFK advocated flexible response with a commitment to fighting small conventional wars to prevent the spread of communism, i.e. Vietnam. How did America react to the assassination of JFK? The country mourned the loss of the president and the idea of what could have been. Kennedy represented a young, new, fresh presence in politics, and many were skeptical of the government after his death. What that does, of course, is it leads us to the end of lesson 1. We hope you were able to get some information about how America changed during the 1960s and the presidency of JFK, or what we some call Camelot or the New Frontier. And remember what we always tell you, but don't take my word for it. Do your own research and draw your own conclusion. And with that, we'll see you next time.